Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners! In mid-April, several groups, including the Islamic Renaissance Party, so Tajikistan's main opposition party operating in exile, Freedom for Eurasia, and the Ukrainian Fund for International Volunteers, filed a lawsuit with the International Criminal Court to hold Tajikistan accountable of what they claim are crimes against humanity. IRPT's leader in exile, Muhyiddin Kabiri, tweeted that it took 4 years to prepare the lawsuit, while the party's lawyer wrote in a post on his LinkedIn profile that the complaint is based on more than 60 documented cases of torture, rape, extrajudicial executions, disappearances, arbitrary detentions, and forced exiles. He also wrote that the evidence includes testimonies, videos, official documents, and court records covering the period from 2002 to 2024, and that the perpetrators of the crimes have been identified, all the way to President Emomali Rahmon and his circle. It will likely take a few years before the ICC decides whether or not to accept the complaint, but the filing itself represents a significant achievement and definitely a glimmer of hope for the Tajik opposition, most of whom are either in prison or abroad. This week, I would like to avoid a lengthy introduction because we are having an amazing guest, Steve Swerdlow, who is one of the world's leading experts on human rights in Central Asia and who will help us make sense of the case, the ICC process, and the situation in Tajikistan. Welcome to Turan Talks. Today, my guest is Steve Swerdlow, human rights lawyer and professor of practice of human rights at the University of Southern California. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Agnieszka.
Really nice to hear you, and I really look forward to this conversation because we've got a very interesting topic to discuss. So basically, as my listeners have already heard, Tajikistan's main opposition party, with some other groups, has decided to take the administration of Emomali Rahmon to the International Criminal Court. So we've known about the human rights abuses for many years, and I'm sure that you will explain a little bit more about that in a second. But I would like to start with something a little bit more personal. So when was your first time in Tajikistan? When was it?
Yeah, no, and first I just wanted to thank you for having me. It's, I've been an admirer of your Central Asia reporting for many years, and I think your podcast is really important, centering voices and focus on this important region. So in terms of my story with Tajikistan, I've been following the country before I got a chance to visit, always been fascinated by its story, by the history of the Civil War and everything that came after. But I only got my first chance to visit the country in 2011 when I was already working as a researcher with Human Rights Watch in Central Asia. And pretty soon thereafter, my permanent base was Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, and I would go regularly. But the first visit was back in 2011, and as I'm sure we'll discuss, Tajikistan looks very different than it does now.
So 2011, it's not that far away. So maybe we can move back a little bit in history and start with what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, just briefly. So Tajikistan fell into civil war between different sides. And what happened then?
Well, it was a bloody civil war, and we still don't know, with 30 years later, we still don't know how many people lost their lives. Some estimates are 30,000 people, which is, by itself bloody, incredibly bloody. But some estimates go as far as 100,000 people losing their lives between 1992 and 1997. As you said, the country broke into ethnic and regional divisions, and you had a very complicated picture. And looking back on it, it's even a little bit harder to understand because sometimes terms like the Islamists or communists don't make really a lot of sense unless you get into the weeds. But essentially, you had kind of the successor forces or the successor power to the Communist Party, which was basically the central forces, which eventually would be led by the now president, Emomali Rahmon, who gets appointed in 1992 to a particular position, which would then in 1994 officially make him president. And you had divisions. So you had parts of the country in the far south that were supporting the president. That's where he comes from. You had the area that we'll talk about later, Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Oblast, which is southeastern Tajikistan, a different ethnic group with a different religious identity called the Pamiris, who were essentially opposed to Dushanbe. You had atrocities committed, really ferocious ones that were piled onto the Pamiris. You also had regions where the party that we'll talk about later, that's connected with this filing in the International Criminal Court, the United Tajik Opposition, which included the moderate Islamist, I should say, democratically oriented Islamist party, or Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, which had its base in an area called Faizabad, north of Dushanbe, fighting. And you also had the far north, right, which is now Khujand, and then was known as Leninabad or Sagdiskaya Oblast, the Sugd region, which had for the Soviet decades been the seat of power in many ways, which was now at a disadvantage. So this was a complicated picture. Went on for 5 years. And a few years ago, a UN mission determined that, there were many enforced disappearances, lots of uncovered mass graves. But, it's on the tombstone, in a way, of those victims that Rahmon eventually sort of seals and consolidates power in 97. And a lot of people talk about this really important moment in 1997 when a peace agreement was reached, brokered by the United Nations, which resulted in Rahmon agreeing to share power and give up a certain number of government posts and to the United Tajik Opposition, the UTO, which included the Islamists. And that would really, the Tajikistan that I eventually visited in 2011, in many ways benefited from that, you could say, pluralism or competitive political framework that came out of the war, which meant that Tajikistan, even though it was always led by an autocrat, there was some competition in the system, or there was some pluralism that was imposed through that peace agreement, which I guess was existentially important for Dushanbe to enter into that agreement to put an end to those abuses. So Tajikistan was very different, right? It's always been the poorest of the post-Soviet republics. It suffered greatly, as we just talked about, in the Civil War. But I think that really unique suffering in some ways gave Tajikistan a vibrant civil society, because you had the UN peacekeeping forces there. You had a strong international presence. You had humanitarian organizations coming in and doing really important aid work and responding to the humanitarian suffering. And then that created a kind of micro universe of NGOs, of activism. And that's the Tajikistan I first got to see, was one in which obviously there was a lot of human rights issues at the time, and a number of which we can discuss, but also at the same time, I would say, compared to neighboring Uzbekistan, certainly compared to neighboring Turkmenistan, Tajikistan had a vibrancy, especially in its civil society, not only in Dushanbe, but in many cities around the country that I got to visit, and also the Pamiri part of the country, the Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Oblast, based in the city of Horog. You had a University of Central Asia there, really high literacy rates compared to the rest of the whole post-Soviet region. And some hope, I guess I could say. And, I would find myself walking around Dushanbe, meeting with a lot of activists, lawyers that I respected. And I was, again, in contrast to places like Uzbekistan that I couldn't visit because of Islam Karimov's hard position on human rights activism at that time, I found Tajikistan to be, relatively speaking, open at that time. And again, got to meet a lot of courageous and brave activists.
Apart from activists, NGOs, and international organizations, there was also a relatively a competitive political scene. And one of the organizations or one of the parties, the opposition parties that was the most prominent at the time was the Islamic Renaissance Party. So the one that is now filing the lawsuit against Emomali Rahman. What can you say about this party and what role it played in Tajikistan politics at the time?
Yeah, Agnieszka, I really like to humanize not just the party, but the people in it, because the reason I even came into contact with, Human Rights Watch and human rights people necessarily aren't about politics or supporting a political party. So why would I get to know the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan? Well, my reason for visiting their headquarters in Dushanbe was because the research I was doing was about the issue of the freedom of religion in Tajikistan. That is, the government was already back then in 2011 starting to move in this direction of completely rigidly controlling mosques, determining what the content of sermons that imams and religious leaders would deliver. They passed this bizarre law that basically banned anyone under the age of 18 from going to a religious institution. It was called the Parental Responsibility Law. And that constellation of issues led me to want to find out what is really going on here. And I wanted to visit, mosques around the country, also look at the situation for minority religions, Christianity and Judaism, look at the Shiite Ismaili Pamiri situation. But so that's why I found myself going to the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, because my contacts and diplomats and others said, you should really speak to Muhyiddin Kabiri, the leader of the party, and the people around him, because they're knowledgeable and they're active in politics. And as you said, Agnieszka, they had 2 seats in the parliament of Tajikistan, which again was a direct result of that 1997 agreement. And I remember my first visit to their party headquarters in Dushanbe. They were about to have, I think it was a 40th anniversary in 2013, commemorating the founding of their party during the Soviet period, when they formed an underground secret organization opposed to the Soviet government, which was officially atheist. And so they were celebrating this. And I remember I met with the deputy to Muhyiddin Kabiri. His name is Mahmoud Ali Haid. And this is a really important individual. He is serving a life sentence right now. Has suffered incredible torture in prison, and he's been jailed since 2016, when the party was, essentially destroyed and all of its members put in prison. And I remember, my reason for meeting with him was to ask him for help to educate me and give me contacts about the situation with religious freedom. And he was willing to help and very knowledgeable. And I would see him at various conferences, international OSCE events around Dushanbe and elsewhere. And this guy knew what he was talking about. And he had been a journalist during the Civil War. He was a far cry from the idea of an Islamist, the stereotypical idea that the government would then paint this party as. They painted them as, fanatics who want Sharia law and despise women's rights and are anti-Semitic and all these things. And me being, an American guy with a Jewish background, I thought about these things, right? I was interested in all these things. And we had a chance to drive around the country, to delve into the history of the party, to talk about the party's belief system. I questioned them on allegations of intolerance to religious minorities, including Jewish people, talked about women's rights. And it was very fascinating getting to know not just him, but a number of people in this party. And again, pretty soon after we met, a few months later, I would return, and Mahmoud Ali Haid was beaten up on the street by some thugs, put in the hospital. And there's a photo that you can, if you Google Mahmoud Ali Haid, that's HAYIT, and Human Rights Watch from around that time, you'll see the photo that I snapped in the hospital bed where he was brutally beaten for no reason other than just being in politics and posing a modest, right? I mean, we want to say, I want to emphasize that this party never, ever could compete with Rahman or push to unseat him, but they were popular. And, by some estimates, they did pretty well in the 2010, I believe it was, or 2011 parliamentary elections. And they say that they had up to 40,000 or 43,000 members. We can't ever really know the truth, but we do know that they were a force. And, autocratic leaders don't like that. So the crackdowns started coming in pretty hot and heavy with this beating. And then later it would it would escalate, and eventually the president would accuse them of mounting a coup and then use that as a pretext to ban the party and put many of its members, including Mahmoud Ali Khaid and others like Rahmatullah Rajab, into prison. And we know that the last 9 years, they have been in really abysmal conditions, and many of them tortured.
The party was banned, as far as I remember, in 2015.
That's right.
And in 2016, a big exodus of people related to the party, but also human rights activists from Tajikistan started. People were traveling through Russia, through Belarus to Europe. Many of them tried to cross into Poland to claim asylum, but the Polish government wasn't really eager to allow them to claim asylum.
Something you know about, something you know very well about.
Exactly. This did not start in 2021. It actually started much earlier. So I remember this time in 2016, I traveled to Belarus to cover the story. And I think also that this is exactly when we met, you and I, for the first time.
Yes.
In Warsaw.
Indeed. I remember.
So what exactly happened? I mean, how Tajikistan came from being a country with relative freedoms to a country from where all the opposition leaders, all the opposition activists and human rights activists are fleeing?
Yeah, no, that's precisely the question, Agnieszka. And it's a story that has to be told. I mean, and again, I sound crazy sitting here and saying that I felt free in walking around Dushanbe, but that is where I would go to, for example, study Uzbek, because you couldn't do that in Uzbekistan if you were with Human Rights Watch. And, that was my experience. And as I said, vibrant community of both grassroots and local NGOs that were doing, providing really essential services and, for example, micro lending to women entrepreneurs with sewing machines. You had those type of NGOs, and then you had the legal ones, the Tajik Center for Human Rights, and then you had the political organizations like the IRPT. So how do we get from, me being able to travel there all as much as I want to what we're in now, which some would say Tajikistan is worse or right up there with Turkmenistan, and it may even exceed Turkmenistan in the number of political prisoners it now has. And so you're talking about that moment, Agnieszka, and this is when we met, so it's pretty faithful. That's when the country's human rights record literally goes off a cliff. And we have to recognize, and I've been beating this drum probably too hard for too long, but it is a crisis. It became a crisis. And where we place the beginning is a subject of debate. Some people say, well, the crisis began when President Rahmon introduced forces into the Gorno-Badakhshan region in 2012, and he ends up killing protesters at that time. That was a very troubling set of events, but it was hard to get to Gabao. It's a 25-hour Jeep ride or very dangerous helicopter ride. So many journalists didn't know about it. We didn't see pictures. It wasn't the same amount of internet penetration at that time. Some people, though, like you were just alluding to, start the crisis more around 2014, which is when the first Tajik opposition politician that we know of that got a really long sentence, and this is when I got really involved, was Zaid Saidov. He tried to start a new party called New Tajikistan. And just for doing that, he got more than 25 years in prison. And many of his associates, his lawyers, his family members start getting harassed. And that's the beginning. And then we move from there to this, as you were talking about, the transnational repression. Also, we always have to mention in any conversation about Tajikistan the significance of the population of Tajiks living in Russia, where, again, sounds crazy to say this, but at that time, there's more relative freedom to discuss politics and the fate of one's country, of Tajikistan, from Russia than in Tajikistan. So therefore, you had politically active Tajiks, a lot of just ordinary folks that wanted something better, and they would go to demonstrations and talk about Tajikistan's future. This was a group called Group 24, which you know very well. You wrote so many stories about this organization. They were based in Russia. They try to mount, again, modest protests, and for doing so, they're labeled terrorists, extremists, and they're hunted all across the world, but really primarily in places like Belarus and elsewhere. And, I think what it is, Agnieszka, is this is the moment when Rahman says to himself, I'm facing an existential threat as I see it, and I will stop at nothing to get to every manifestation of perceived criticism, and I will put a stop to it, whether it means issuing Interpol red notices to arrest people as they cross borders, or if it means imprisoning people or harassing their relatives, including their children. So we see the whole gamut of violations beginning around this time, around, like you said, between 2014 and 2016 is when I would say the crisis really goes off a cliff. And ever since then, we've been dealing with a rogue state. We've been dealing with one of the most repressive human rights situations in the globe that not too many people know about.
So, if we can look at like more closely at the repertoire of oppression that Tajikistan uses around the world, because not only within Tajikistan but also abroad, what kind of strategies are kind of the most visible or the most common or the most striking?
Most striking. Well, unfortunately, it's an abundance of riches, Agnieszka. Probably, I would say two cases I'll mention first in terms of the oppression abroad that stick with me and changed my life, transformed the way I viewed these topics. When I had a chance to go to Moldova, of all places, I met the brother of a young activist who literally disappeared off the streets of St. Petersburg for just being interested in politics. Again, getting interested in this organization called Group 24, which was started by a businessman Umar Ali Kuvatov, that had fallen out with the ruling family and then started an opposition movement, again, largely based in Russia. But his young activist, migrant worker party members that were volunteering just to raise awareness about issues in Tajikistan, such as, again, the discriminating conditions or humiliating conditions for Tajik migrants in Russia, or the state of women's rights, or the state of corruption. Just for doing that, this young activist named Ehson Adinayev literally disappeared. And we don't know if he is alive or dead to this day. I wrote a report called "He Disappeared for Freedom." That was something his mother told me when we met back in 2016 in Moldova, where she had fled to with her other son, Vaisidin Aginayev, and we became close. And I started documenting the case back then. And just the idea that you would literally disappear, forcibly disappear. I think he was 25, maybe he's 24, and just end his life, or again subject his family and his loved ones to this just absolute terror, which continues. And that's the difficulty with disappearance cases, is you never get any closure. You don't know if they're alive or dead. And so the ambiguity of that situation is torture in itself. And so I'm still in touch with the family, and I follow these cases. And a report that I wrote in 2023 for Crude Accountability, an NGO, documents that there may be 30 to 40 at least cases of enforced disappearances and incommunicado detention. That's when you isolate someone in jail and you don't let them contact their lawyer or their family members. There are many cases of Tajikistan doing that. That's one case. The other case I want to mention in terms of striking, you said, right? Well, that's, of course, the founder of Group 24, the businessman, Umar Ali Kuvatov, who I also had a chance to meet. For starting his party, he becomes an international fugitive. They issue red notices to stop him. He gets detained. I think when we first spoke, he was in a prison in Dubai. Called me from prison and said, "Steve, this is the situation. Can you help? Can Human Rights Watch help?" And I started writing about the case, started learning about what he's going through. And then that would take him on an odyssey through various countries. And he would go to Kazakhstan and he would go to Kyrgyzstan. And we met. And I got a chance to see that, again, he may have not have been the most sophisticated political thinker, but what he was trying to do was essentially peaceful. And it was political activism and peaceful political activism, something the government, certainly no politician wants to be challenged. But the whole basic idea of human rights is that that people have a right to criticize and free speech. And these are the commitments that Tajikistan signed up for when it signed the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, when it joined the United Nations. So Kuvatov, I stay in touch with him, And I don't know if we had actually planned to meet up in Istanbul, but we were certainly in touch right before I got the news in March 2015 that he had been invited to plov, right, which is the favorite dish of any Central Asian, by some other Tajiks that had befriended him or that he knew in Istanbul, Turkey, which, as we know, lots of Central Asians, it's sort of a mecca for a lot of Central Asians of all stripes and political persuasions. And he goes to this dinner one night, starts to feel sick, gets up, walks out of this person's home onto the street, as I understand it, and then is shot and assassinated and killed. And this was really, I would say, 9 years later, still, or 10 years later, I'm sorry, 10 years later, we're in 2025, one of the most striking cases of transnational repression, one of the most, really indicative of the cruelty of this government with regard to its perceived critics, and still no justice whatsoever for Kuvatov, for his wife. His wife eventually fled to a safe third country. But that is a case that sticks with me. And we haven't even gotten to, the main plaintiffs, you could say, behind the filing in the International Criminal Court, which is coming from a different group, which is, as we mentioned, the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan. They were largely in Tajikistan. So when we talk about the IRPT, we're talking more about what's happening to people inside the country. Although, as you said, in 2016, you started to document the people fleeing from this party to places like Poland and also to Turkey. And they also had, their share of detentions and various problems.
So we have examples of the Tajik security services basically operating on foreign soil, for example, in Russia, in Turkey, and basically nobody faces any consequences. What is more, European countries, including Poland, my country, have been deporting people back to Tajikistan.
Yes.
Knowing that those people will most certainly face imprisonment or will get disappeared. This is something that I have been, struggling with, and it's something that I completely don't understand. So maybe to just have even more evidence of what the situation in Tajikistan is, do you know, or do we know what the conditions in Tajikistan's prisons are? Do we know anything about what people are facing there?
We do. And we know for the worst reason, Agnieszka. Well, first of all, let me say that if the government had nothing to hide in its prisons, then why, for years, for almost 20 years, I believe, if not, around that length of time, maybe a little bit more, why does the government not allow the UN, meaning the International Committee for the Red Cross, we call it the ICRC, to monitor its prisons, which the ICRC has requested to monitor and to access for many years and has been told no? That's the first fact in any conversation about prisons in Tajikistan we should take note of. It has not allowed independent monitors, the experts, to come in and take a look. Now, we've known that they've had political prisoners going back to at least the early 2000s, if not before. And again, those are documented in some of my reports and others. But what we know, again, for the worst reason, is that Tajikistan's prisons have been the site of so-called prison riots, which have resulted then in the army or the police or the security forces opening fire and killing scores of prisoners. We had an incident like this in 2018. In 2019, we also had a convoy from one prison to another that was transporting, I want to say, around 10 prisoners or more who were fed days old or weeks old bread and died, and were basically held inside of the back of a truck, in a lorry. And we've had that tragic incident happen. And then just a few months ago, we had another prison riot where we get these photos coming out that are government manipulated, or where some of the prisoners were alleged to be members of ISIS. And that's what the government has said a few times in these lethal and tragic events where disproportionate force is used. But the government essentially claims that there are ISIS or Islamic State cells with representatives in Tajikistan's prisons. And of course, they try to connect that as best as they can, as they often do, to the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, for which there's no evidence and to support that claim. One should say that the leader of that party, Muhyiddin Kabiri, regularly, who is based in Europe, regularly talks about their completely peaceful orientation and their their total disavowal of of violent methods to to change things. They believe in gradual political democratic reforms and competitive politics. So the government has engaged in these really violent, overtaking what they call prison riots. So we've had dozens of people killed in just the last 6 years inside of prisons. We also know that people are tortured. I mentioned Mahmoud Ali Khaid. He has been tortured numerous times. Zaid Saidov, who I mentioned, tortured. Bozorgmir Yorov, the famed Tajik lawyer who, in his trial, when he was in prison because he represented members of the IRPT. In 2016, he was imprisoned. His brother, Jamshed Yorov, based in Poland, continues to raise a lot of awareness about his brother's case. Also, organizations like Freedom Now. But Yorov famously, quoted poetry at his own trial, calling Rahman a sort of king, with no clothes. He has been tortured. So what we do know, Agnieszka, is torture is rife. Torture is systematic. It's widespread, and it's an issue of incredible concern for me and for UN human rights bodies and experts and journalists, of course.
So before we get to the lawsuit itself, which I'm sure that you know a lot about, I would like to talk about one more thing, which you've mentioned already, Gorno-Badakhshan. Can we talk about that now and about the 2022 crash of peaceful protests in Gorno-Badakhshan?
I'd love to. And yeah, everything in Tajikistan is complicated. So I mean, it's amazingly ambitious to take this all out in one conversation. But yes, I mean, Gorno-Badakhshan is, again, it's such an interesting history because, like the other autonomous regions, we call them autonomous oblasts that appear around Central Asia and elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, like Abkhazia or South Ossetia. Gorno-Badakhshan had its own relationship with Moscow, right? This goes all the way back to Lenin and the creation of this federation, to the idea of trying to entice different ethnic minorities and groups to join the Soviet Union. And so Gorno-Badakhshan, and I can't go back into all the precise specifics of when it got the vestiges of statehood, but essentially it had its own identity. It had its own distinct identity and different relationship. As we know, Tajikistan, even as itself, was not a separate Soviet Socialist republic. It was incorporated, or it was subsumed by what was then the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic. And so there are many changes, but the point is that the Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Oblast had a very important status. Khorog, the capital city, had a direct relationship with Moscow. And Moscow, I think, by virtue of Gorno-Badakhshan being, as is in the name Gorno, very mountainous, very far, probably the furthest flung region from Moscow possible. For that reason, perhaps, or maybe because of the freedom-loving spirit of the region, or its important strategic position on the border with China, the area got resources.
And the border with Afghanistan as well.
And of course, right, which you also know very well. As we know, Badakhshan straddles Afghanistan and Gorno-Badakhshan, the Afghan side and the Tajik side. And so, yes, any border regions were highly strategic. So what I'm trying to say, though, is that Moscow gave a lot of resources. And for that reason, we saw really high literacy rates of education. You had a sort of, we're mentioning Tajikistan having this vibrant civil society. When I first started going to Tajikistan, that's what I was so fascinated by among Pamiris, was not just the amazing sort of political orientation in civil society, but I should say, the sort of flourishing of cultural museums and ethnography and music and leading arts and culture. I mean, Pamiris are different, right, in this splendid sort of way. I mean, and women's rights also were somewhat different because of a kind of liberalism and maybe higher educational levels. You would often find, maybe you'd see girls wearing skirts in Kharog, the way we kind of discuss like Iran in the 1970s before the revolution, or Afghanistan before, the Taliban and all those changes. Kharog and Gorno-Badakhshan had a really interesting sort of liberal. I don't want to say everyone was like this. It was also very traditional and conservative, but you had support for education. So I'm trying to emphasize that. You also had the Aga Khan, the spiritual leader of the Pamiri people, who are not just Shiite, but Ismaili Shiite. That's a very specific sect of Islam, which again is, in some ways very progressive. And so you had funding from the Aga Khan coming from abroad to support universities, cultural institutions, NGOs. And this was really special. Like other mountainous peoples in particular, like if you look at Georgia, the Pamiris also, they were very tied to their land. They're very, very independent. And this is why in 1992, they were the first region to actually declare independence from the collapsing, Tajikistan Soviet Socialist Republic. And on the road to the Civil War, the Declaration of Independence from Gorno-Badakhshan was a very important moment. And it caused the Dushanbe Central Forces to crack down hard and to punish the Pamiris. And ever since then, in 2012, in 2014, in 2018, we see Dushanbe introducing troops and more control in an attempt to take back whatever independence that Gorno-Badakhshan had, whatever autonomy, I should say, because it was never independent, and they never did follow through, and they were never able to become independent. But essentially, they entered into this uncomfortable status quo where Dushanbe wasn't really necessarily able to determine local politics as much. And you had community leaders. Of course, Dushanbe likes to call them warlords, but you had Pamiri community leaders and institutions that were largely self-governing. And what we saw up until 2022, these events that you're asking me about, was that Gorno-Badakhshan was different precisely because it did have a high degree of autonomy. And the governor was Pamiri, and the mayors, and the community leaders, and the clerics, the Ismaili clerics. They had a prominence and an ability to, really determine a lot of things. Of course, Tajikistan was gradually moving in more and more. And what Rahmon did, his strategy, and, people like the scholars Ed Lemon and many others have documented how over time, between 1997 and 2022, Rahmon picks off all the regions that could potentially pose a threat to his total consolidation of power. And you saw, armed operations at different points in different parts of Tajikistan. That we just talked about what happens with the IRPT. It happens all over Tajikistan, but the last region that was standing out, that was resisting, you could say, that was not completely subsumed by Emomali Rahmon and his family and there's corrupt clique that's controlling the country, is Gorno-Badakhshan. And so in 2022, in May, that's when the government really, really cracks down. Again, you had protests dating back to November 2021 over the death of an athlete in police custody named Gulbidin Ziobekov. And that then sparks protests, which erupt again in May 2022. And that's when the government sends in forces. They start confronting peaceful protests in Rushan, in Horog. They open fire and they kill, somewhere between, over 20 to maybe 50 eventually people, which is a bloody, we're talking about 250,000 people in Gorno-Badakhshan, a very tight-knit insular community. But these, I would call, and we'll get into the legal stuff later, crimes against humanity, or, extrajudicial killings, unlawful use of force. And that, Agnieszka, then leads to a further crackdown, which is essentially to totally annihilate Gorno-Badakhshan's autonomy, to imprison every significant cultural figure, political activist, even the ones that developed a commission to negotiate with the government. Like, for example, there's a young man who's about 32, Faramuz Ergashev, who talked about running for president eventually, but his main job as a lawyer was to try to negotiate some peace with Dushanbe and calm the situation. And so he forms a group, or he's part of a group called Commission 44. He is then imprisoned as well as a terrorist, and he gets a very long prison sentence. Another woman who's put in prison, Ulfat Khonim Mamachoyeva, I'm sure you remember this case, Pamiri journalist who had worked as a training journalists and making films and doing lots of important work for years and years and years. She's maybe even a grandmother, definitely a mother. just a lovely person. Everyone can't say enough wonderful things about Rofat Ghanim. And one day in mid 2022, the government arrests her, and then they put out this video that they say they've gotten from a meeting that she sat down with foreign diplomats in a cafe that you probably know, Sigafredo, in the center of Dushanbe. And it issues this footage and says, look, she's a spy and she's conspiring with the West to overthrow our government, and we're going to put her away forever. And so right now, she's one of the people, Faramuz, or my friend Manucher Holik Nazarov, who is the head of the Pamiri Lawyers Association. Again, someone that you would turn to if you wanted to calm the situation, if you wanted to work together as the government to, form some institute stability. He was also put in prison. And so all of these sort of amazing people, really amazing people, are now languishing in Tajikistan's prisons. And unlike some of the neighboring countries, we've actually seen surprisingly little progress. I mean, we sometimes see, these governments bargain with people. Kazakhstan, sort of gives, is sometimes prone to releasing people early and or finding ways to use them as bargaining chips in advance of bilateral meetings. Uzbekistan certainly does that. Kyrgyzstan certainly does that, but not Tajikistan. Tajikistan very rarely, I can maybe count on my hand how many people who have avoided these lengthy prison sentences, and those are very rare instances, and they give me some hope. But essentially what we're dealing with now, Agnieszka, is a huge population, maybe 1,000, maybe more, political prisoners in Tajikistan's jails, and I've only mentioned a few of their names. So the Pamiris, for the last 3 years, have been sitting in a lockdown where radio broadcasts that were previously in Pamiri, which is a different language than Tajik, are basically banned. Cultural institutions, religious institutions shut down, NGOs liquidated, the Aga Khan Foundation had its property expropriated. So it is a really dire situation in Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Region.
So we know what is happening in Tajikistan. Tell me why the IRPT decided to file the lawsuit now. Why now, and what it involved to actually file the lawsuit? Is it a complicated procedure, to do something like that?
Yeah, no. And if you allow, I want to explain a little bit about how this is even possible, like how it is that Tajikistan has a relationship with the International Criminal Court. But let me say to start with that I am not the lawyer on this case. I am a lawyer, but I'm not the lawyer on this case. And I hope your podcast will speak to them. Also, the organization that really took the lead on this, led by the fantastic activist Leila Nazgul Seyitbek, Freedom for Eurasia, has really been at the center of this effort, along with the Norwegian Helsinki Committee that you know. And they've worked with the victims, the survivors of repression, the members of the IRPD, and often their family members who are, trying as best they can 10 years on to support people like Mahmoud Ali Khaid or my friend Rahmatullah Rajab, who was not just a party member, but was actually worked as a driver for Human Rights Watch when I was in Tajikistan. He's now suffered torture in prison. So it's the relatives, the families, the sons, the daughters of these men who are in prison, spending their lives, watching their lives, and several have died in prison. We get these reports, unfortunately, they're happening more frequently, of elderly members of the party that were imprisoned just passing away. So this is a situation where, after so much suffering, I mean, this is, I don't want to, I'm not being dramatic when I say it. This is momentous. This is a triumph. I see this as an incredibly important and significant move by this NGO, Freedom for Eurasia, and the IRPT, because, it's a David and Goliath. It's basically saying, look, we're facing numerous threats to our existence, and we will try to use international law to the extent it exists to save the lives of, of our family members, to get some accountability, to pursue some justice for all these atrocious abuses that have been continuous and unrelenting for years in Tajikistan. So I think, this is, what we like to see in human rights is often we think about, well, what kind of pressure is going to work on a regime that does not ever seem to want to release people, that does not respond to pressure. And I'm of the belief that the United States, European Union, and many other actors have absolutely fallen down on their responsibility to pressure this government. But putting that aside, this is an example of Tajik civil society standing up and saying, we're going to try something else. We're going to try a completely different venue that's never been tried before. And Agnieszka, is it okay? Would you allow me to give a little bit of the law professor here on
Yes,
the
absolutely.
court
Please
itself?
do. Please do.
Because not too many people know this story, and I'll be honest with you, I didn't know either that Tajikistan was a member of the International Criminal Court. I sort of found out, I guess you could say, by mistake. And why is this interesting? Well, when we see the ICC, we call it the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which is a body that was established in 1998 after, the precedent set by going after the dictator Augusto Pinochet in Chile, after the Rwandan genocide caused so much devastation. 800,000 people killed in 100 days, or after the Bosnian genocide, Srebrenica. After those events, the community of the world, the human rights activists, lawyers, and even a lot of people in the US government at that time, talking about the Bill Clinton presidency, got together and they said, you know what? Now that we've had these ad hoc tribunals in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, we need a permanent court. We need something to say never again, where we can actually try not the governments, not the states, but the people, the perpetrators, the individual perpetrators of the worst, most heinous crimes. So it wasn't a court that was set up to sort of look at everything. It was a court only with a very narrow, as we call it, jurisdiction, right? A very narrow scope, which was, we will try the perpetrators responsible for essentially 4 crimes. Only 4 crimes go into this. That's genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the other crime of aggression, which is to invade a country illegally. And we can get to that another time. But those 3 crimes, those first 3, are the only crimes. And the only time the International Criminal Court has the power to do anything is if they find that the government, the states, are unable to offer any kind of justice. And so it's a very limited jurisdiction, as we say, and it's a court of last resort, and they have to abide by what's called the principle of complementarity, meaning they're not going to duplicate some kind of national prosecution. So, for example, if Germany is already prosecuting a crime, you cannot then appeal to the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court will say, well, you've already got a national court system that's doing something. So in the case of Tajikistan, why is this so interesting? And how did we know about this? Well, I can't speak for Freedom for Eurasia or the IRPT, but in terms of my knowledge, and I was somebody that professionally on a daily basis was searching for solutions for impunity in Tajikistan. I did not even consider the International Criminal Court because I always associated it with those stories of war and peace and genocide that were more in the headlines, like Rwanda, like Sudan, like Darfur, like Slobodan Milosevic and Kosovo, right? And so it didn't enter my mind, but the moment it did was actually in 2018, 2019. If you remember, that's the time when we start talking really about how China is pursuing Uyghur Muslims all over the world, trying to extradite and forcibly return Uyghurs, a different ethnic Muslim minority that was from Xinjiang province, and trying to imprison them, and asking other countries like Turkey, like Uzbekistan, like Kazakhstan primarily, to send back the people that they considered to be, their enemies. And guess what? Well, it happens that some Uyghurs made their way to Tajikistan, right? I mean, these countries border each other. We talked about Tajikistan shares a border not just with Afghanistan, but with China. And so all of a sudden, there's a Chinese human rights organization that puts out a press release that says that if Tajikistan, if you extradite, if you forcibly return Uyghurs to their death or to torture and certain imprisonment in China, you could be violating the International Criminal Court. And I said, oh my God, what's this? What do you mean, International Criminal Court? Tajikistan, International Criminal Court? There's no connection. And then I looked closer and I saw there was a whole story here that, what we were talking about in the beginning of this podcast, you asked me about the Civil War. Tajikistan is in tatters. And at that time, when they were looking for a way to put the country back together, when the government at that time was more amenable to conversations about international peace and security, That is precisely, if you think back to it, right? 1997. Well, the court gets going in 1998. It gets up and running and ramps up in 2001. And so it's that period of time when Tajikistan is most open, you could say, or most susceptible, depending on how you want to characterize it, to these conversations. And they were, some might say pressured. I like to think of it as maybe some unwitting bureaucrat or presidential advisor didn't really look at the fine print of what this would mean if they signed the International Criminal Court. But the bottom line is that no other country in Central Asia signed and ratified this treaty. So it's only Tajikistan. Tajikistan is the only country in Central Asia that becomes a member of the International Criminal Court. And when I realized that existed, that venue actually existed, it was really, again, late in the game, well into this human rights crisis. And so I'm only speculating, but I believe that the lawyers on this case, saw this as not necessarily a last resort. I mean, there are other forms of pressure too, but as a good way to pressure the government because Tajikistan willingly, voluntarily, consciously entered into this court, became a member, and by doing so, they committed themselves to being, to having anyone responsible on their territory for committing the crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes held accountable. And when we're talking about enforced disappearances, when we're talking about systematic and widespread torture, when we're talking about the intimidation of relatives, intense surveillance, harassment, and the shutting down of free speech and the eradication, as they say in this lawsuit, of the political opposition, many of them fit within different categories of what we call crimes against humanity. And that includes a long list: murder, imprisonment, enforced disappearance, or the crime of what we call also persecution. And what I've been focused on more, Agnieszka, recently and since 2022 is very much looking at the Pamiri case as a crime against humanity. When you shut down a whole ethnic group, their ability to study their language, to have organizations to self-govern, when you take every significant political leader and imprison them and torture them, you've got a whole list of crimes against humanity. And so I was looking sort of in parallel at the same time about the crimes against humanity that could be tried at the International Criminal Court when this effort was ongoing. And I did have a chance to speak with some of the plaintiffs here, you could say, or the victims, the survivors. And I know that the work they put into it, you asked me, was stellar. It was grueling. We're talking about preparing evidence for the office of the prosecutor, who will painstakingly, very rigorously, and methodically examine every word and make sure that every allegation of abuse is corroborated by evidence. And so this is a mammoth effort. It did take years. And since I'm in touch with some of the Tajik families that are the subject of this complaint, I can say that this was definitely a really historic day. When it was filed on April 10th, I got a chance to speak with some of them, and many were really buoyed and happy to see that they were at least asserting themselves. They were taking this underdog stance and using an institution that is precisely meant to uphold human rights, and hoping that the office of the prosecutor will initiate an investigation and start this process.
So what will happen now? So what is happening when a lawsuit like that is filed? And what are the chances of winning?
Well, it's somewhat opaque, and we could spend hours talking about all the criticisms of the International Criminal Court. And, as you and I sit here talking about this, we have Hungary, very loudly withdrew from the court and had Benjamin Netanyahu making a state visit there. Of course, he's famously the subject of one of their arrest warrants for war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. We also have Putin, right, who is also the subject of an indictment for war crimes and crimes against humanity, sitting in Moscow. Although we do know that he's had to make some calculations about where he travels to. He did. There were calls, for example, from my former colleagues at Human Rights Watch on Mongolia to arrest Putin if he went there. Unfortunately, they did not do so. But I do think that, like with the case of Slobodan Milosevic, right, who we never thought Milosevic would be in the dock, he did end up there. And he died tragically before he saw the inside of a jail. or he was in a detention center, but he died before that conviction could be delivered. He died in the course of the trial. But, I got to tell you how inspiring it was that people testified against him, that he had to sit there day in and day out and listen to those stories of survivors of torture, of war crimes. And, that was a measure of justice. And Charles Taylor, the dictator of Liberia, he's sitting in a courtroom. I'm sorry, he's sitting in a jail cell for life outside of London, following a very important trial, the Special Court for Sierra Leone. So the truth is that the leaders do eventually get justice. I know I sound a little bit maybe cheesy here saying this, that it's a long road, but I do think we get there. And so in the case of the International Criminal Court, it will take some time. We'll have to see if the prosecutor will review this communication. They'll look at all the evidence. They'll probably, hopefully, meet with civil society. They'll meet, I think, with the victims and the authors of this complaint and come to some conclusion. And again, just the filing of the case is so important. And I'm hopeful that there's going to be additional filings, additional evidence. I'm sure there's some efforts underway to supplement this. I do believe on the Pamiri case, there's also an effort underway. I should say this, though, Agnieszka, you talked about even European countries that are sending Tajik asylum seekers, peaceful political activists, or just ordinary folks back to Tajikistan to be tortured and imprisoned. And one thing that I see happening in parallel, like when you have a case like this that's filed, when you do the work to investigate and lay out the claims of a crime against humanity, well, you don't just have to sit there and wait, right? You don't have to wait for the International Criminal Court to act. In fact, that's the opposite of what we should do as human rights activists. So one thing that I've been advocating for, other courts also using what we call universal jurisdiction, right? That's the idea that when you're talking about genocide or when you're talking about crimes against humanity, they're so heinous, those crimes, that they should be tried in many courts, not just in the International Criminal Court. And so one place that I've been hopeful that we could see justice also in parallel to the ICC process is Germany. Germany is sort of become a hub for international human rights prosecutions. We saw a really famous case of a Syrian torturer and perpetrator of torture that successfully concluded in a trial that put him away. This was someone that was, a torture perpetrator under the Assad regime. We also have seen filings on behalf of Ukraine against Russia for genocide, on behalf of Belarusian civil society against Lukashenko for crimes against humanity in Germany. And Germany has become a really active place for what we call universal jurisdiction. It used to be Belgium, and as I mentioned before, Pinochet, that was in Spain. But now Germany is really the center. And because you have many Tajik immigrants there, emigres, I think it's a natural place. So what I predict is that this ICC filing will eventually, we'll have to see what the prosecutor says and does. Only the prosecutor can really, or a like-minded state, or Tajikistan itself, if we had a change of government, they wanted to initiate the case, they could also petition the court, of course, to investigate and examine these serious allegations. But I think what we'll see as a result of this legal work, human rights work, is more activity and hopefully some parallel filings and maybe opening of investigations. I'd like to see in Germany. And of course, always we have the other things going on, like the UN bodies that review Tajikistan will look closely at this. And, wherever there is a theater, an audience to review the crisis in Tajikistan, I think what this filing does is it just so beautifully brings together all the important facts and connects them to those definitions of crimes against humanity that, that demand action, that demand attention. So I'm just proud to know many of the people involved in this effort. But as a lawyer, of course, I want to see the prosecutor open the investigation. Of course, were we to get to that stage, then we'd be faced with a question of what we call head of state immunity. Does Rahman have to personally face a courtroom? I would say the answer is yes, but also the other people around him, like Simon Yatima, the head of the Tajikistan Security Services, is definitely a prime candidate. And, you talked about the transnational repression underway in different countries, the disappearances, the assassinations, the killings. A lot of the people in the upper apparatus, in the Minister of Interior Affairs, the Prosecutor General, these are the people that on day-to-day basis are prosecuting the human rights violations. And I think they have been personally named in this. in this case, and the pressure is certainly ratcheted up on them. So we should, by no means, should we sit and wait for the court to act. I think we should be looking at other courts, and I also think we should be asking other jurisdictions, other governments like Japan, Australia, UK, the EU to impose sanctions, personal sanctions, on the individuals listed in this complaint who are responsible for the most egregious human rights abuses.
Thank you, Steve. This was super interesting and very enlightening. So let's hope all that you just mentioned will happen. And thank you so much for joining this conversation.
It was an honor, Agnieszka. Thank you so much for highlighting this.
Thank you. That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.